Well, hello again, friends. It is so good to be with you and preaching. As some of you may know, I served as a hospital chaplain for a couple years during seminary. And during this time, I would walk around with a list, literally a list of patients and their room numbers. And I would have to go one by one, offering them a pastoral care visit or at least leaving them information for chaplain services. And I remember one day, towards the end of my shift, I have to confess that I was quite tired by this point. I had one person left on my list, and I was really hoping that they would decline so that I could go home in a timely manner. And I remember I tapped on her door, and this might be pastoral malpractice, but I remember I told her, I see that you're watching TV. So I'm just going to leave this information here on your table. It's for pastoral care services. Reach out to us if you would ever like a visit or prayer. And as I made my way back out the door, she said, "Oh, are you a pastor?" And she raised her clicker and turned off her TV. "Please pull up a chair." And I knew at that moment that I was not going anywhere soon. As I sat with her, she began to share with me her life. She shared with me that she had grown up in a family where her parents abused her heavily, and her parents were also heavily addicted to substances. She shared with me that she grew up and to fall into the same addictions, and she said that she hated herself because she abused and hurt her own children in a very similar way that she experienced. She told me that she felt that she was trapped in a dark cycle that she could not get out of, which is the language she used. Trapped in this dark cycle for many years. However, she said, and at this point her face lit up in her story, she told me that recently her adult daughter, who they had not spoken for years, had recently reached out to her. And I told her that she wanted to figure out what it would look like to have a healthy relationship for the first time. And so she said that this unexpected, this surprising invitation that affirmed her and that called her to be in relationship once again warmed her heart and empowered her to move forward, to seek sobriety, to find a community that supported her in that. And she had now been 6 months sober and connecting with her daughter and feeling, as she said, more fully alive than ever, even though she found herself in the hospital due to medical complications because of her years of addiction. In all of this, she describes something that we religious folks call grace. This unexpected gift, this love and affirmation that calls us into relationship, like her adult daughter did, that calls us. This is how God comes to us with the good and the bad things that we do, inviting us as a free gift. We don't have to earn God's favor. We don't have to prove ourselves to anyone or even to ourselves, but it's this existential, spiritual awareness that we are fully accepted and loved and invited into relationship, which is what brings us new life, but also is what empowers us to be more like God's love in the world, is what we call grace. And I think is what she was describing, this patient, even though she said that she was not really a church-going person. We are presently in a worship series titled Reignite, where we are looking at the early sparks that started this movement of the people that we call Methodism, which we are still a part of today as a church in the Methodist tradition. Last week we talked about how one of the sparks of early Methodism was that mission is always over model. That is, our mission to create communities in the way of Jesus and to make new disciples for the transformation of the world is always over any model or structure or way of doing church. That really any way of doing church can be played with in order for the sake of mission, of reaching new people. And in fact, that is how Methodism started. Today, the second spark I want to name is God's grace. In the Methodist tradition, in early Methodism, God's grace is central to our understanding of God and of ourselves in God and what it means to be church. That God is centrally known by God's free gift of love upon our lives, something that we don't earn, something that is not dependent on our beliefs or lack thereof beliefs. John Wesley, who is the founder of Methodism, talked about the idea of prevenient grace. This grace that comes to us before we could even be aware of it. That's not dependent on our conceptions or knowledge or ideas, but rather it's something that we could discover in our lives, we could experience, knowing that God fully sees us and accepts us and invites us into a relationship of love. And this grace transforms us as well. It moves us forward to being more like God's love in the world. It is the power of God in our very lives. Again, grace is God's free gift of love. John Wesley not only talked about grace, but he had an experience of it as well that is very famous. It's called often the Aldersgate experience. John Wesley was also in a dark time in his life, a very different dark time than the patient I just talked about, but one that was hard nonetheless. At this point in John Wesley's life, as you may know, he was a priest, an Anglican priest in England in the 1800s. And he, at this point in his ministry, he had come back from mission work in the new colonies, and he felt like a failure because things didn't pan out quite like he wished. But more than just feeling like a failure in his career as a minister, he struggled, and he journaled about this a lot. He struggled with deep existential questions of whether he was worthy of being loved, of whether God loved him. He wondered why he couldn't feel any joy in his life, the joy of the Lord at all. These questions of feeling whether you are worthy of being loved, if you're proving yourself, I think it's something that we've all struggled with in one way or another. And so did John Wesley. And it really wasn't until he got invited one day to a small group or a society group where they would be studying the Bible. Particularly, they were looking at the passage that Sharon Fisher read for us today. They were looking at Martin Luther's commentary on that passage from Romans. And as he said he went unwillingly to this meeting. He said that he heard someone reflecting on that passage, reflecting on the way that God works in the human heart. And as he was hearing this, he felt his heart strangely warmed. For the first time, he felt his heart strangely warmed, he says. Now, as you may remember from last week, John Wesley was an uber-educated person fresh out of Oxford University. And so he has had many ways of thinking about God and talking about God. But this experience of his heart being strangely warmed in the midst of his deep existential crisis is one of the first times that he experienced God in his life. He went from just thinking about God to actually experiencing God, God's very fire within him as his heart was warmed. Friends, this is what grace feels like. It is something that's beyond our intellectual concepts. It is a connection with God that affirms us and that moves us forward, that empowers us in the world. And this is indeed what empowered John Wesley to do much of his work in rethinking church and having mission over model. And much of his life centrally was that we have to share this gift of grace because God has shared God's grace with us as well. When has your heart been strangely warmed? When have you been stunned by God's grace in your life unexpectedly? Often it comes when we are in the midst of struggle, when we feel like we are trapped in dark cycles in our lives. This past week, I felt my heart strangely warmed as I heard Amanda Gorman, a young Black woman, actually the youngest ever to speak at an inauguration. Her poetic words spoke new life into me and into much of our nation. And there's one line that I think captures well this experience of being stunned by grace, of having God strangely warm our hearts in the midst of our struggles. She said, in the context of the inauguration this past week, "We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour. But within it, we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves." I invite you to look up the entire video or the lyrics of her poem online. Amanda Gorman was reminding us that we are in a time of struggle, of pain, a terrifying hour in many sense in our nation as we continue to struggle with a global pandemic, with a raising mortality rate, with systemic racism and so many other issues. Yet, in the midst of all this, we are surprised by being empowered and feeling that we can have the power to author a new chapter, a chapter of hope and laughter in the midst of it all. In the text that Sharon read for us today, that Romans text that Wesley also read so long ago, the Apostle Paul talks about a hope that will not put you to shame. In other translations, it says, a hope that will not disappoint. Now, if you're like me, even during this past week of inauguration, of new starts, as hopeful as they are, I often struggle with hope. You see, because I am a little skeptical about making hope my starting point because I've been disappointed so many times. And so sometimes I even fall to being a little cynical and not wanting to get my hopes up because I don't want to be disappointed, even when change seems to be happening for the good. But if you notice in today's text, the Apostle Paul does not anchor hope as our starting point. Rather, he mentions our problems as our starting point, or in other translations, suffering as a starting point. I think what the Apostle Paul is getting at is that hope is never the starting point in our lives. Rather, our real messy lives of pain and struggle, of existential questions, if we could even be loved, if we are failures or not, of whether we are trapped in these dark cycles of systemic racism and abuse and all these things in our world, the good and the bad. That is our starting point. Real life is our starting point. Yet in the midst of that, God infuses hope. For when all other things fail, when we realize that we cannot prove ourselves to be good enough, or we cannot pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and make it, that we cannot be self-reliant human beings. When we realize all these things, then what is left is hope. And hope leads us to new things. And that realization of hope in the midst of struggle, in the midst of darkness, is what we religious folk call grace. Grace is the awareness that God is in the midst of our human suffering or problems, as the text said today. And I think this is resurrection hope. And I need this kind of hope, even as cynical as I can be about hope. Because that is the hope that surprises us, and it is a hope of grace that is left standing after we are dredged through Good Friday. It is, again, resurrection hope. Resurrection hope emerges when God infuses grace into the world in the midst of a global pandemic, economic collapse, and continuing lockdown and systemic racism. Yet, in the midst of all that, we encounter grace, and there is hope once again. And as cynical as I can be, I need this kind of hope. We need this kind of hope. Because this hope will not disappoint, will not put us to shame, as the Apostle Paul says. A hope that comes from a God who has experienced birth and love and friendships and lepers and prostitutes and betrayal and suffering and death, even on a cross. A God that descended to hell itself, Only a God who has borne our human suffering and problems can offer us any real hope in a world of problems and suffering. And I believe that God's grace does not produce a cheerful optimism that it seeks to ignore real life struggle and problems. Rather, it catches us by surprise, and it warms our hearts when they are most cold, when the world is most cold. God's grace infuses us and warms our hearts and offers us a hope that God is still willing to write our stories anew, that God is still writing the future, that our stories are not over, that John Wesley's story was not over when he was feeling like a failure, or that that patient in that hospital room, her story was not over, that your story is not over, and that University Temple's story is not over. Our nation's story is not over. God continues to write it anew. This is what grace feels like and looks like in our world. Friends, the hope that the Apostle Paul is talking about is one that insists to us that there is no pain, no hell in which resurrection is impossible. So whatever you are going through now, whatever uncertainties and unfinishedness that you are experiencing as an individual, as a nation, as a church, whatever we are going through, may we know that God's grace is always among us, that God is always gifting God's self to us. And this awareness, this experience can lead us to new hope, to resurrection hope that is talked about in the scriptures today. That, again, grace is the second spark that I want to outline of Methodism. The idea that God is not something that we need to prove ourselves to, but rather God's grace is in our lives even before we realize it's something that it is a free gift that empowers us to move forward in God's love. May we hold this true today as we move forward into the future, into new life. As I finished my conversation with that patient in that hospital room, she shared with me that she wasn't a church-going person, but she told me that she felt like someone or something, that God was involved in her life, because she felt that for the first time she had been liberated from this cycle that she had been trapped in so long. And she wanted to commit to that. So I shared with her about thinking about possibly joining a spiritual community, a church. But along with that, I told her that one way that she could commit to this grace in her life was through baptism. She had not been baptized, and so much later, after my shift had officially ended, I found myself with a seashell in my hand filled with water, and we had an iPad where her daughter was FaceTiming in and watching her, along with her granddaughters. And while she sat on her bed with a seashell in my hand with water, I baptized her in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, the one God and Mother to all of us. And this was an outward sign of an invisible grace. We believe that the sacraments are a means of God's grace. And Wesley talked about our whole world being filled with means of grace, and that we ourselves are empowered to be means of grace in the world. May you this week rely on that grace. May you this week have an experience where your heart is strangely warmed with God's grace. And may you be empowered to be God's grace for others in the world. Amen.